Good morning, folks. It's Saturday of the Easter weekend, and we've left the videos until now to give you a little bit of a break, to give us a little bit of a break. And because I've been talking about the sun a lot, haven't I? And it's absolutely glorious. Sunglasses, bit of hay fever, so getting some shade and sitting indoors for a few minutes. And I'm going to finish Lemony Snicket now. I saved it really because I don't like reading the end of a book. I feel a bit sad that it's finished. And sometimes when I know I've got a few pages left, I don't read it for a while. I come back later and I savour it. Now, because the last two chapters are fairly short, I'm going to read them both together. So we have a finale, so you can settle yourself down to listen to the last couple of chapters when you're ready. Anytime over the Easter holidays, if you want to listen to how it ends. I know that on the last chapter, it looked inevitable that Violet would have to marry Count Olaf in the play, and there's not a lot that can be done about it. And seeing as it's called The Bad Beginning, I don't see how things could end particularly well. And I say that because it's a series, and it's not just that this is the beginning of the series. But let's see what happens in chapter 12 and 13. Unlucky for some. As Violet and Klaus Baudelaire stood, still in their nightgown and pyjamas, backstage at Count Olaf's theatre, they were of two minds. A phrase here which means they felt two different ways at the same time. On one hand, they were of course filled with dread. From the murmur of voices they heard on the stage, the two Baudelaire orphans could tell that the performance of the marvellous marriage had begun, and it seemed too late to do anything to foil Count Olaf's plan. On the other hand, however, they were fascinated, as they'd never been backstage at a theatrical production before, and there was so much to see. Members of Count Olaf's theatre troupe hurried this way and that, too busy to even glance at the children. Three very short men were carrying a large flat piece of wood, painted to look like a living room. The two white-faced women were arranging flowers in a vase that from far away looked to be marble, but close up looked more like cardboard. An important-looking man with warts all over his face was adjusting enormous light fixtures. As the children peeked on stage, they could see Count Olaf in his fancy suit. He was rehearsing some lines from the play just before going on for his scene. Just as the curtain came down, he stood there gazing out into the audience. The curtain was controlled by a woman with very short hair who was pulling on a long rope attached to a pulley. Despite their fear, you see, the two older Baudelaires were very interested in what was going on and only wished they weren't involved in any way. As the curtain fell, Count Olaf strode off stage and looked at the children. It's the end of Act 2. Why aren't the orphans in their costumes? He hissed this to the two white-faced women. Then as the audience broke into applause, his angry expression turned to one of joy, and he walked back on stage. Gesturing to the short-haired woman to raise the curtain, he strode to the exact centre of the stage and took elaborate bows as the curtain came up. He waved and blew kisses to the audience as the curtain came down again, and then his face once again filled with anger. Intermission is only 10 minutes, he said, and then the children must perform. Get them into costumes quickly. Without a word, the two white-faced women grabbed Violet and Klaus by the wrists and led them into a dressing room. The room was dusty but shiny, covered in mirrors and tiny lights, so the actors could see better to put on their makeup and their wigs. And there were people calling out to one another and laughing as they changed their clothes. One white-faced woman yanked Violet's arms high up and pulled her nightgown off over her head, and she thrust a dirty, lacy white dress at her to put on. Klaus, meanwhile, had his pyjamas removed by the other white-faced woman and was hurriedly stuffed into a blue tailor suit that itched and made him look like a toddler. "Isn't this exciting?" said a voice, and the children turned to see Justice Strauss, all dressed up in her judge's robes and powdered wig. She was clutching a small book. "You children look wonderful." "So do you," Klaus said. "What's that book?" "Why, those are my lines," Justice Strauss said. "Count Olaf told me to bring a law book and to read the real wedding ceremony, to make the play seem as realistic as possible. All you have to say, Violet, is 'I do,' but I have to make quite a speech. This is going to be such fun." "You know what would be fun," Violet said carefully, "is if you changed the lines a little bit. Change them around just a little." Klaus's face lit up. Yes, Justice Strauss, be creative. There's no reason to stick to the legal ceremony. It's not as if it's a real wedding. Justice Strauss frowned. I don't know about that, children, she said. I think it would be best to follow Count Olaf's instructions. After all, he is in charge. Justice Strauss, a voice called. Justice Strauss, please report to the makeup artist. Oh my word, I get to wear makeup, Justice Strauss had a dreamy expression on her face, as if she were just about to be crowned the queen, instead of having just powders and creams smeared on her face. Children, I must go. See you on stage, my dears. Justice Strauss ran off, leaving the children to finish changing into their costumes. One of the white-faced women put a flowered headdress on Violet, who realised in horror that the dress she had been changed into was a bridal gown. The other woman put a sailor cap on Klaus, who gazed in one of the mirrors, astonished at how ugly he looked. His eyes met those of Violet, who was looking in the mirror as well. What can we do? Klaus said quietly. Pretend to be sick? Maybe they'll call off the performance. Count Olaf would know what we were up to, Violet replied glumly. Act 3 of The Marvellous Marriage by Alf van Koot is about to begin, a man with a clipboard shouted. Everyone please get in your places for Act 3. The actors rushed out of the room, and the white-faced women grabbed the children and hustled them out after them. The backstage area was in complete pandemonium, a word here which means actors and stage hands running around, attending to last-minute details. The bald man with the long nose hurried by the children, then stopped himself, looked at Violet in her wedding dress, and he smirked. No funny stuff, he said to them, waggling a bony finger. Remember when you go out there, just do exactly what you're supposed to do. Count Olaf will be holding his walkie-talkie in the entire act, and if you do even one thing wrong, he'll be giving Sonny a call up there in the tower. Yes, Klaus said bitterly. He was tired of being threatened in the same way, over and over and over again. You better do exactly as planned, the man said again. I'm sure they will, a voice said suddenly, and the children turned to see Mr. Poe, dressed very formally and accompanied by his wife. He smiled at the children and came over to shake their hands. Polly and I just wanted to tell you to break a leg. What? Klaus said, alarmed. That's a theatre term, Mr. Poe explained. It means good luck on tonight's performance. I'm glad that you children have adjusted to life with your new father and you're participating in family activities. Mr. Poe, Klaus said quickly, Violet and I have something to tell you. It's very important. What is it? Mr. Poe said. Yes, said Count Olaf from behind. What is it that you have to tell Mr. Poe, children? Count Olaf had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, and his shiny eyes glared at the children meaningfully. In one hand, Violet and Klaus could see he held a walkie-talkie. Just that we appreciate all you've done for us, Mr. Poe, Klaus said weakly. That's all we wanted to say. Of course, Mr. Poe said, patting him on the back. Well, Polly and I had better take our seats. Break a leg, Baudelaires. I wish we could break a leg, Klaus whispered to Violet, and Mr. Poe left. You will, soon enough, Count Olaf said, pushing the two children toward the stage. Other actors were milling about, finding their places for Act 3, and Justice Strauss was off in a corner practicing her lines from her law book. Klaus took a look around the stage, wondering if anyone there could help. The bald man with the long nose took Klaus's hand and led him to one side. You and I will stand here for the whole duration of the act. The whole thing. I know what duration means, Klaus said. No nonsense, the bald man said. Klaus watched his sister in her wedding gown take her place next to Count Olaf as the curtain rose, and Klaus heard applause from the audience as Act 3 of The Marvellous Marriage began. It will be of no interest to you if I describe the action of this insipid, the word insipid here means dull and foolish play by Alf van Koot, because it was a dreadful play, and of no real importance to the story. Various actors and actresses performed very dull dialogue, and they moved around the set, and Klaus tried to make eye contact with them and see if they would help. He soon realised this play must have been chosen merely as an excuse for Olaf's evil plan, not at all for its entertainment value, as he sensed the audience was losing interest very quickly and moving around in their seats. Klaus turned his attention to the audience to see whether any of them would notice that something was afoot. But the way the wart-faced man had arranged the lights prevented Klaus from seeing the faces in the auditorium, and he could only make out the dim outlines of people in the audience. Count Olaf had a great number of very long speeches, which he performed with elaborate gestures and facial expressions, and no one seemed to notice that he held a walkie-talkie all at the same time. Finally, Justice Strauss began speaking, and Klaus saw that she was reading directly from her legal book. Her eyes were sparkling and her face flushed as she performed on stage for the first time, too starstruck to realise that she was a part of Olaf's plan. She spoke on and on about Olaf and Violet caring for each other in sickness and in health, and in good times and bad, and all those things that are said to many people who decide for one reason or another to get married. When she finished her speech, Justice Strauss turned to Count Olaf and asked, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Count Olaf said, smiling, and Klaus saw Violet shudder. "Do you," Justice Strauss said, turning to Violet, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Violet said. Klaus clenched his fists. His sister had said "I do" in the presence of a judge. Once she signed the official document, the wedding was legally valid, and now Klaus could see that Justice Strauss was taking the document from one of the other actors and holding it out to Violet to sign. "Don't move an inch," the bald man said to Klaus, and Klaus thought of poor Sonny dangling at the top of the tower, and he stood still as he watched Violet take a long quill pen from Count Olaf. Violet's eyes were wide as she looked down at the document, and her face was pale, and her left hand was trembling as she signed her name. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Count Olaf said, stepping forward to address the audience, "I have an announcement. There is no reason to continue tonight's performance, for its purpose has been served. This has not been a scene of fiction. My marriage to Violet Baudelaire is perfectly legal, and now I am in control of her entire fortune." There were gasps from the audience, and some of the actors looked at one another in shock. Not everyone apparently had known about Olaf's plan. "That can't be," Justice Strauss cried. "The marriage laws in this community are quite simple," Count Olaf said. "The bride must say 'I do' in the presence of a judge like yourself, and she must sign an explanatory document. And all of you here," Count Olaf gestured out to the audience, "you are all witnesses." "But Violet's only a child," one of the actors said. "She's not old enough to marry." "She is if her legal guardian agrees," Count Olaf said. "And in addition to being her husband, I am also her legal guardian." "But that piece of paper is not an official document," Justice Strauss said. "That's just a stage prop." Count Olaf took the paper from Violet's hand and gave it to Justice Strauss. "I think if you look at it closely, you will see it is an official document from the City Hall." Justice Strauss took the document in her hand and she read it quickly. Then, closing her eyes, she sighed deeply and she furrowed her brow, thinking hard. Klaus watched her and wondered if this were the expression Justice Strauss had on her face whenever she was serving in the High Court. "You're right," she said finally to Count Olaf. "This marriage unfortunately is completely legal. Violet said 'I do' and she signed her name here on this paper. Count Olaf, you are Violet's husband, and therefore you are in complete control of her estate." "That can't be," said a voice from the audience, and Klaus recognised it as the voice of Mr. Poe. He ran up the stairs to the stage and took the document from Justice Strauss. "This is dreadful nonsense." "I'm afraid this dreadful nonsense is the law," Justice Strauss said. Her eyes were filling up with tears. "I can't believe how easily I was tricked," she said. "I would never do anything to harm you children, never." "You were easily tricked," Count Olaf said, grinning, and the judge began to cry. "It was child's play winning this fortune. Now, if all of you will excuse me, my bride and I need to go home for our first night together." "First, let Sonny go," Klaus burst out. "You promised to let her go." Excuse me. "Where is Sonny?" Mr. Poe asked. "She's all tied up at the moment," Count Olaf said, if you'll pardon a little joke. His eyes shone as he pressed buttons on the walkie-talkie, and he waited while the hook-handed man answered. "Hello? Yes, of course, it's me, yes, you know, you idiot. Yes, everything's gone according to plan. Please remove Sonny from her cage and bring her directly to the theatre. Klaus and Sonny have some chores to do before they go to bed." Count Olaf gave Klaus a sharp look. "Are you satisfied now?" he asked. "Yes," Klaus said quietly. He wasn't satisfied at all, of course, but at least his baby sister was no longer dangling from a tower. Don't think you're so safe, the bald man whispered to Klaus. Count Olaf will take care of you and your sisters later. He doesn't want to do it in front of all these people. He did not have to explain to Klaus what he meant by the phrase take care of. Well, I'm not satisfied at all, Mr. Poe said. It's absolutely horrendous. It's completely monstrous. It's financially dreadful. I'm afraid, however, Count Olaf said, that it is legally binding. Tomorrow, Mr. Poe, I shall come down to the bank and withdraw the complete Baudelaire fortune. Mr. Poe opened his mouth as if to say something, but began to cough instead. For several coughs, seconds, he coughed into a handkerchief while everyone waited for him to speak. I won't allow it, Mr. Poe finally gasped, wiping his mouth. I absolutely will not allow it. I'm afraid you'll have to, Count Olaf replied. I'm afraid Count Olaf is right, Justice Strauss said, through her tears. The marriage is legally binding. Begging your pardon, Violet said suddenly, but I think you may be wrong. Everyone turned to look at the oldest Baudelaire orphan. What did you say, Countess? Olaf said. I am not your Countess, Violet said testily, a word here which means in an extremely annoyed tone. At least I don't think I am. And why is that? Count Olaf said. I did not sign the document in my own hand, as the law states, Violet said. What do you mean? We all saw you. Count Olaf's eyebrows were beginning to rise in anger. I'm afraid your husband is right, dear, Justice Strauss said sadly. There's no use denying it. There are too many witnesses. Like most people, Violet said, I am right-handed. But I signed the document with my left hand. What? Count Olaf cried. He snatched the paper from Justice Strauss and looked down at it. His eyes were shining very bright. You are a liar! He hissed at Violet. No, she's not, Klaus said excitedly. I remember, because I watched her left hand trembling as she signed her name. It's impossible to prove, Count Olaf said. If you like, Violet said, I shall be happy to sign my name again on a separate piece of paper, with my right hand and then my left, and we can compare. We can see which signature the one on the document most resembles. A small detail like which hand you use to sign, Count Olaf said, doesn't matter in the least. If you don't mind, sir, Mr. Poe said, I'd like Justice Strauss to make that decision. Everyone looked at Justice Strauss, who was wiping away the last of her tears. Let me see, she said quietly, and she closed her eyes again. She sighed deeply, and the Baudelaire orphans, and all who liked them, held their breath as Justice Strauss furrowed her brow, thinking hard about the situation. Finally she smiled. If Violet is indeed right-handed, she said carefully, and she signed the document with her left hand, then it follows that the signature does not fulfil the requirements of the nuptial laws. The law clearly states the document must be signed in the bride's own hand. Therefore, we can conclude that the marriage is invalid. Violet, you are not a countess, and Count Olaf, you are not in control of the Baudelaire fortune. Hooray! Cried a voice from the audience, and several people applauded. Unless you are a lawyer, it will probably strike you as odd that Count Olaf's plan was defeated by Violet signing with her left hand instead of her right. But the law is an odd thing. For instance, one country in Europe has a law that requires all its bakers to sell bread at the exact same price. A certain island has a law that forbids anyone from removing its fruit. And a town not too far from where you live has a law that bars me from coming within 5 miles of its borders. Had Violet signed the marriage contract with her right hand, the law would have made her a miserable contessa. But because she signed it with her left hand, she remained, to her relief, a miserable orphan. What was good news to Violet and her siblings was bad news to Count Olaf. Nevertheless, he gave everyone a grim smile. In that case, he said to Violet, pushing a button on the walkie-talkie, you will either marry me again and correctly this time, or I will... Nepo! Sonny's unmistakable voice rang out over Count Olaf's as she tottered on stage toward her siblings. The hook-handed man followed behind her, his walkie-talkie buzzing and crackling. Count Olaf was too late. Sonny, you're safe, Klaus cried, and he embraced her. Violet rushed over, and the 2 other Baudelaires fussed over the youngest one. Somebody bring her something to eat, Violet said. She must be very hungry after hanging in a tower window all that time. Cake! Sonny shrieked. Ah! Count Olaf roared. He began to pace back and forth like an animal in a cage, pausing only to point a finger at Violet. You may not be my wife, he said, but you are still my daughter, and... Do you honestly think, Mr. Poe said in an exasperated voice, that I will allow you to continue to care for these 3 children after the treachery that I have seen here tonight? The orphans are mine, Count Olaf insisted, and with me they shall stay. There is nothing illegal about trying to marry someone. But there is something illegal about dangling an infant out of a tower window, Justice Strauss said indignantly. You, Count Olaf, will go to jail, yes, and the 3 children will live with me. Arrest him, a voice said from the audience, and other people took up the cry, send him to jail, he's an evil man, and give us our money back. It was a lousy play. Mr. Poe took Count Olaf's arm, and after a brief eruption of coughs, announced in a harsh voice, I hereby arrest you in the name of the law. Oh, Justice Strauss, Violet said, did you really, really mean what you said? Can we really live with you? Of course I mean it, Justice Strauss said. I'm very fond of you children, and I feel responsible for your welfare. Can we use your library every day? Klaus asked. Can we work in the garden? Violet asked. Cake! Sonny shrieked again, and everyone laughed. At this point in the story, though, I feel obliged to stop and interrupt and give you one last warning. As I said at the very beginning, the book you are holding in your hands does not have a happy ending. It may appear now that Count Olaf will go to jail and that the 3 Baudelaire youngsters will live happily ever after with Justice Strauss, but it is not so. If you like, you may shut the book this instant and not read the unhappy ending that is to follow. You may spend the rest of your lives believing that the Baudelaires triumphed over Count Olaf and lived the rest of their lives in the house and the library of Justice Strauss, but that is not as the story goes. For as everyone was laughing at Sonny's cry for cake, the important-looking man with all the warts on his face was sneaking toward the controls for the lighting of the theatre. Quick as a wink, the man flicked the main switch so that all the lights went off and everyone was standing in darkness. Instantly, pandemonium ensued as everyone ran this way and that, shouting at one another. Actors tripped over members of the audience tripped over theatrical props. Mr. Poe grabbed his wife, thinking it was Count Olaf. Klaus grabbed Sonny and held her up as high as he could so she wouldn't get hurt. But Violet knew at once what had happened, and she made her way very carefully to where she remembered the lights had been. When the play was being performed, Violet had watched the light controls carefully, taking mental notes in case these devices came in handy for an invention. She was certain if she could find the switch, she could turn it back on. Her arm stretched in front of her as if she were blind. Violet made her way across the stage, stepping carefully around pieces of furniture and startled actors. Had a double interruption and Mr. Poe coughing fit, but I'm going to finish now, sorry. Violet had watched the light controls carefully, taking mental notes in case these devices came in handy for an invention. She was certain if she could find the switch, she could turn it back on. Her arm stretched in front of her as if she were blind. Violet made her way across the stage, stepping carefully around pieces of furniture and startled actors. In the darkness, Violet looked like a ghost, her white wedding gown moving slowly across the stage. Then, just as she reached the switch, Violet felt a hand on her shoulder. A figure leaned in to whisper into her ear. I'll get my hands on your fortune if it's the last thing I do, the voice hissed. And when I have it, I will kill you and your siblings with my own 2 hands. Violet gave a little cry of terror but flicked the switch on. The entire theatre was flooded with light. Everyone blinked and looked around, and Mr. Poe let go of his wife. Klaus put Sonny down, but nobody was touching Violet's shoulder. Count Olaf was gone. Where did he go? Mr. Poe shouted. Where did they all go? The Baudelaire youngsters looked around and saw that not only had Count Olaf vanished, but his accomplices, the wart-faced man, the hook-handed man, the bald man with the long nose, the enormous person who looked like neither a man nor a woman, and the 2 white-faced women had vanished along with him. They must have run outside, Klaus said, while it was still dark. Mr. Poe led the way outside, and Justice Strauss and the children followed. Way down the block they could see a long black car driving away into the night. Maybe it contained Count Olaf and his associates. Maybe it didn't. But in any case, it turned a corner and disappeared into the dark city as the children watched without a word. Blast it, Mr. Poe said, they've gone. But don't worry, children, we'll catch them. I'm going to call the police immediately. Violet, Klaus and Sonny looked at one another and knew that it wasn't as simple as Mr. Poe said. Count Olaf would take care to stay out of sight as he planned his next move. He was far too clever to be captured by the likes of Mr. Poe. Well, let's go home, children, Justice Strauss said. We can worry about this in the morning when I've fixed you a good breakfast. Mr. Poe coughed. Wait a minute, he said, looking down at the floor. I'm sorry to tell you this, children, but I cannot allow you to be raised by someone who is not a relative. What? Violet cried. After all Justice Strauss has done for us? We would never have figured out Count Olaf's plan without her in her library, Klaus said. Without Justice Strauss, we would have lost our lives. That may be so, Mr. Poe said, and I thank Justice Strauss for her generosity, but your parents' will is very specific. You must be adopted by a relative. Tonight you will stay with me in my home, and tomorrow I shall go to the bank and figure out what to do with you. I'm sorry, but that is the way it is. The children looked at Justice Strauss, who sighed heavily, and hugged each other, and they hugged Justice Strauss separately. Mr. Poe is right, she said sadly. He must respect your parents' wishes. Don't you want to do what your parents wanted for you, children? Violet, Klaus and Sunny pictured their loving parents and wished more than ever that the fire had not occurred. Never, never had they felt so alone. They wanted very badly to live with this kind and generous woman, but they knew that it simply could not be done. I guess you're right, Justice Strauss, Violet said finally. We will miss you very much. I will miss you too, she said, and her eyes filled with tears once more. Then they each gave Justice Strauss one last embrace and they followed Mr. and Mrs. Poe to the car. The Baudelaire orphans piled into the back seat and peered out the back window at Justice Strauss, who was crying and waving to them. Ahead of them were the darkened streets, where Count Olaf had escaped to plan more treachery. Behind them was the kind judge, who had taken such an interest in their 3 children. To Violet, Klaus and Sunny it seemed that Mr. Poe and the law had made the incorrect decision to take them away from the possibility of a happy life with Justice Strauss and toward an unknown fate with some unknown relative. They didn't understand it, but like so many unfortunate events in life, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it isn't to be so. The Baudelaires bunched up together against the cold night air, and they kept waving out the back window. The car drove farther and farther away until Justice Strauss was merely a speck in the distance, and it seemed to the children they were moving in an aberrant, the word aberrant here means very, very wrong and causing much grief, in an aberrant direction. So we're just left with the unknown now, that they're almost back where they started, and the next step could be just as bad or worse, maybe. But you'll know probably that the series of unfortunate events is a series of books, and the next one I think is The Reptile Room. So there's a whole set of books that you might be able to get hold of, you might be able to borrow. You might well find the full text online for those books, because this one is online. And I'm sure many of you have seen the film versions, sort of serialized versions on TV. You might find them if you have Netflix or Sky. You might be available for you to watch. It's quite an interesting idea to look at the difference between the book and how it's been filmed. So that's been our first read for this unusual period of time that we're trying to make as engaging and interesting as possible for you. It has been quiet on the channel for this month, or these couple of weeks, so far, because it's Easter and we want you to have a break. We'll be back soon with more talks, some lovely stuff on Macbeth and Lord of the Flies and the poetry, maybe a little on Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde. We'll see how things transpire. If you want videos about anything in particular, let us know and we'll see what we can do. This was a long one. Hopefully you've seen it through to the end. Have a good long weekend and take care. Stay indoors or stay at home. Try and get outside into the sunshine if you can. See you soon.